Bonjour à tous. Aujourd'hui, pour cette session du séminaire Forêts, Climat et Société, on est ravis d'accueillir Vilis Brukas, qui est au visiting au bêta depuis début septembre et qui reste encore une semaine, et qui est sinon professeur à SLU, donc l'université suédoise de sciences agricoles, et qui s'intéresse notamment aux politiques forestières. Et donc, le séminaire se tiendra en anglais. So, as I said, we were very happy to welcome you for this seminar. You're here in beta for visiting since beginning of September, and you're a professor in forest policy at SLU.
Yes.
So you can start when you want.
Great, thank you. I hope you can hear me, and the system can hear, right? The mic works. Normally, I don't use mic. I'm a shouter. I just shout to the people, but okay. So very nice to see you all. I actually would like to start with saying big thanks to Marielle Brunet, but also not least Jens, my old friend. I felt so welcoming, despite that my French still at very, very initial stage, let's say so. But I feel very welcomed here in this environment, and I actually love Nancy. I think we're privileged, like Art Nouveau, capital of France, and so I was enjoying my time here in many respects. And then we have this presentation called a stick or a sermon. Everyone knows what it is, yes? So this is a stick, right? Good one. And then sermon is like a priest standing in the church and saying what is right or wrong thing to do. So it's about balancing the voluntary approaches or coercive approaches in the forest policy. And why I chose this topic, it's due to my own background of the whole career, because I originate from Lithuania, which in the time when I was born was Soviet Union still, and it's very much relying on sticks still. And when I made PhD in Denmark, actually at the same time when Jens was doing his PhD there, which has very different approach. And then I ended up doing my research career and educational career at SLU in Sweden, still a different country. And the thing that was striking me very much, that in such a small geographic area, these countries are quite close to each other. And southern Sweden latitudes the same conditions, basically, for climate, soil, and so on. But forests are managed in so different ways. And the question is why, and that, of course, relates also to this issue of what sort of forest policy instruments are used. And that also made that I drifted from being a forester. I have a master's degree in forestry from Lithuania, and then I made my PhD in forest planning in Denmark, but I drifted towards forest policy area because I find it so exciting. And I chose these two central themes for talk. And I would say this one is a very old one. The first one, Forest Management Plan as Policy Instrument. It's referring to some research dating some years back. And the second one is on advisory services in multiple contexts. That's very fresh. We just recently started the project. And I have been working actually last week very much with this topic. So hopefully you can follow my very fast Lithuanian English. Just say if I'm too fast, you can slow me down, and also you can ask questions along the way. And then I have this thing, it works. Yes, so I start still some words about where do I come from. So this dark area on the map, that's Sweden. And SLU, that's my university, Sveriges Lantbruksuniversitet, as I already could follow some French, actually, you said. The Swedish Agricultural University, or University of Agricultural Sciences, to be more correct. But actually, sometimes jokingly, we call it a different way, SLU, that stands for Sweden's longest university. Because as you see, Sweden, okay, France is also big, but for that region, Sweden is quite a big country and quite much extended south to north direction. And we have all the sites all over, we see, and the three main campuses are both Umeå, Uppsala, and Alnarp. So our vice chancellor or rector sits in Uppsala. The dean sits in Umeå, so forest faculty is mainly seated in Umeå, very big one, probably the biggest forest faculty in the world, around 700 people. And then we have a branch in Alnarp in very south. And I come from this area. We have a department called Southern Swedish Forest Research Center. And when we are doing research here on different areas, despite that we are just small part of a faculty, we are rather big compared to many other forest research groups in other countries. So we do different sort of things: ecology, silviculture, forest pathology, forest policy and planning are kind of our strongest areas. And then I myself represent this group in forest policy and planning. We are 9 people at the moment. So you see quite a few PhD students dealing with different topics, but I would place mostly in forest policy or planning with very strong connection to forest policy. We have 2 people that I would say more classical forest planners. They do a lot of modeling at different scales. And then the rest of us, we do different things. Of course, with indicative keywords, but different sort of things that are more in forest policy and governance. And if to a little bit explain about our group, who we are, so some simple things that actually most of us do have a degree in forestry, which is quite, maybe you can say, is for good and for bad. Good thing is that even if we do forest governance research, for example, we have quite good understanding what is going on in the forest. The bad side of it that maybe we are not so good at, for example, theories in political science. I never studied political science, so of course, as always, there are pros and cons. And we, not all of us, but many of us, including myself, we love to use qualitative methods, like making interviews, so focus groups, whatever, discussing things and then making sense out of that. And I think partly maybe because many of us are foresters deep in our blood, we also like this approach of trying to solve actual problems and not so much developing theories or methods. And this working with practical issues also, you can frame it in different ways, but I would say that we are very open to different approaches, from very quite radical critique, what is being done, for example, in Sweden, and saying we need a transformational change and push for that, through more marginal change. You kind of try to nudge systems or practices to other directions, step by step. And when you work this way, it's much easier sometimes to collaborate to those who really have a lot of power in the system. Oh, now I clicked something wrong. Back. Yes, so here, I don't know if you can see, or should I even put off these slides here? Can you see the map? That's the map of the Baltic Sea region. And probably many of you would recognize this country right here is Sweden. There's quite a lot of green color there, right? It's a very, very forested country. So 28 million hectares of forest land, quite a bit, right? And actually forest cover is almost 70%, so that's second largest share of forest in the EU. First is Finland. And here you see this number, harvest increment ratio, which is quite important indicator for many things. It basically shows how intensively forests are utilized. And you see that the European average, this is taken from Forest Europe, and it's actually data is quite old, from 2015. But it's a good source because the data are collected in a harmonized way, because otherwise, if you look with harvest interest increment data from different countries, it could be very shaky, different methodology and so on. But this is harmonized. So European average was 73%. And as you see, most of the countries in this region, they have higher. And who has the highest? You see, Sweden. By the way, do you know what it is in France? Very important number. Yeah, very good guess. Back in this Forest Europe statistic, it was 60. And I was checking, I cannot guarantee 100% right, but it looks like over the last years, it was staying quite stable there, somewhere between 50–60%, which I would say is pretty low. French forests are not utilized very intensively on average, or maybe it can then depend on region, of course, but on average, I would say pretty low intensity. And this is a slide showing some also interesting numbers, but this is only Nordic countries now. And the different colors stand for different countries, but the two big ones is Finland and Sweden. Sweden is blue. So you see on the top bar here, forest area. In the global context, what is the share? 2%. Not terribly much. But if you look at all these numbers, how much sawnwood and pulpwood is produced or a bit exported, it's quite huge. So for example, some 15% for pulpwood production share in the world. So intensive utilization, and I would say in terms of economics, is very successful. Pretty well developed forest industries. So I would say economically it's a hub or the leader of, in Europe. Of course, it comes with some price. You maybe don't find so many old spruces in Sweden as in France, for example, even though it's also a tricky issue because probably quite a few spruces in France were blown down by storm damage, right? But anyways, of course, intensive utilization comes at some price. And then we are back to this key topic of today. Of course, the way you manage forest, it depends on how do you govern forest and what are the political priorities and what sort of policy instruments you use. And this is a very nice study. If somebody is interested, I can really recommend from 2018. There was a cost action called Faces Map, and they have been looking at property right regimes all over Europe, in many countries. Those are colored, they had analyzed. And you see super big range. So the more dark blue color, the more management freedom forest owner has. The less you have, the lighter the color, the less freedom. It ranges from 12 to 81%, so a huge, enormous range. And then you can also see quite clear geographic gradient, yes? The further east, actually in the south, Europe also quite often similar situation, but the further east, you have the more less freedom, which also correlates pretty well those countries who have been under socialism. They still like, as I said, this thing. and then if you look north, it's much more freedom. France in between, but more towards the free direction. Where do you have France? 60% around. And now I come to this first topic. Forest management plan as policy instrument. So I know that not all of you are foresters, and I know how well you are familiar with the concept of forest management plan. But it's basically quite simple technical document if you just look at the plan, which doesn't make much difference if you look at it in France, Sweden, or any other country in the world. So basically you have a person called forest management planner. He goes out to the woods. If he gets a contract to make a plan for a certain owner, he would measure, he would look, he would delineate some management units that we normally call as stands, and then propose management action, normally 10 years, could be other periods, but 10 years. Within 10 years, you should do this or do that on that area. And normally also including some maps to show for the owner where things should be done or not done or something. So technically speaking, it's quite similar product anywhere in Europe, for example. But if we consider that it could be maybe also used as a policy instrument, so first of all, question comes, what is a forest policy instrument, right? And there are many definitions you can find in the literature, but this is the one that I kind of adapted myself and like. Basically, what is saying that you have somebody on the top, some governance agency or so government, and they want that forests are managed in certain ways. So those who are governed, they should manage in certain desirable matter. So how to achieve that? For that, you use certain policy instruments. But one very important notion, and this comes here, I cite two French sociologists, like, I think I cannot pronounce, Lacombe and Legales or something like that. Sorry for that. But It is not like somebody sits and calculates, okay, this is the perfect subsidy, and let's just take it and apply. Many of you, of course, would imagine that doesn't work in practice that way. Normally, any proposal would enter different policy processes. It's quite complicated, a lot of different interests clash. So what you have, those set of policy instruments that are out there now, they are, of course, outcome of all these complicated political processes. And now also, what is policy instrument? I know quite a few of you are economists, so you would be very familiar with quite wide classes of economic instruments like taxes, subsidies, and things like that. But normally the most common way to classify is threefold, in three classes. So you have, again, the sticks. This is actually two forest economists from Italy, just old reference. But they call it mandatory, but it's like you do it by force. It's written in the law, so you see to it that it's implemented. And then you have the carrots or economic tools, or the third broad class is sermons or informational forest policy instruments, when you try to persuade people that you do a certain way. And now I always prefer to ask questions to people. So you will have to now to answer to me. What do you think? A forest management plan, is it a stick, a carrot, or a sermon? At least prevalently. And I will not continue before I get answers. So just think. So how many of you vote that it is a stick, primarily a stick? A few, yes. How many say it's a sermon? Not so many, but still. 3 people I found. I think it was 5 for first. How many say a carrot?
Salvation.
A carrot is economic instruments. Could be like subsidies or something like that. Or tax. I see, actually very interesting because very equal distribution.
It can be a carrot. For example, in France, you are taxed only on 25% of the value of the forest, provided that you provide a forest management plan. So
you see, exactly.
It is needed forest management plan to get this tax reduction.
Very good point. Because I was on the next slide trying to provide some sort of examples. How can we imagine that forest management plan can be a policy instrument? So regulatory is quite easy to imagine, especially for a country like where I come from, Lithuania. If you have certain law saying you should do this or that, very often in such countries it's also quite important to have forest management plan in compulsory. And when it says you do this or that. So basically forest management plan operationalizing the requirement of the law, putting it into operation in practice, so to say. Economic instrumentation, it can be exactly as you provided an example here. And in many countries, including Sweden, it is, for example, a requirement if you want to get certified, you have to have forest management plan. So it is, in a way, indirectly at least, becoming economic instrument. And informational can be in many ways. And I have tried to group at least 2 major ways, because management planning, of course, is a good way to get information about what sort of forest you have out there. So you have collected this sort of information as a governor on the top, you can have a better decision base. And of course, very important second role here, this is classically what we mean by sermons. But you can encourage owner, maybe it's not strictly saying you should do that, but you can encourage owner to you do a certain way. So all 3 possible to manage, right? And then one more conceptual slide here. So very important to pay attention to the actors and the context. So if we take this perspective of forest management plan as a forest policy instrument, so these are the guys that are supposed to behave in the right way, right? These are the guys, some sort of governmental authorities who want things to happen a certain way. So the governors and those being governed. And in between you have a planner. So you can call it a social intermediary that puts forward the technical intermediate tool, the plan, to operate. And of course, this doesn't happen in a vacuum, it happens in certain contexts. And you can define context in many different ways. But one way to group it could be institutional context, and then it's what sort of rules or regulations are there. There are different actors with very different interests and power. Or other dimension is ideas, ideational context. What sorts of ideas, values, norms are prevailing in the system? And this was this old study from 2012 when I was interviewing forest management planners in southern Sweden and in Lithuania, the two countries that I know quite a lot about. So easier to relate. And we talked about all sorts of topics, but I will not go through to save time. Just I will mention that many of you may be not so accustomed to doing interviews. You might do service or something, but doing, in my mind, doing interviews is a very exciting thing. Normal recommendation interview should be about half an hour. Okay, maybe 1 hour. But look here. Sometimes it was 5 hours. I was meeting them in person. Of course, nowadays it would be Zoom or something. Back in time, it was in person, traveling long distance somewhere in Sweden. And they were so eager to tell about all these methods, how they work, actually. So it was quite amazing. So of course, here I extract very, very tiny share of what we found out. But in Sweden, the system looks like that you have normally in southern Sweden, planner that is affiliated either with Southern Swedish Forest Agency, that was back in time, not now any longer, or Forest Owner Association Södra. And Forest Owner Associations in Sweden, that is very big deal. There have been many hundreds back in time, but they're merging and merging. Now we have 3. One in north, one in the middle, one in southern Sweden. Super powerful. 53,000 forest owners are members of Södra. It's covering half of private forest in southern Sweden. And we have really powerful industries. Some sawmilling, but especially pulp is among world leaders. So we have Swedish Forest Agency as governors, and then you have forest owner, which is compared to France quite big, right? 40 hectares is not so little in European comparison on average. And if you look at this context, so if to put it very simple terms, it's pretty liberal legal environment. We also made analysis in different studies of this, but it's not terribly much that forest law says you do this or that. Of course, you have to regenerate forest, but otherwise how you manage is quite a lot up to the owner to decide. And then they have this so-called freedom with responsibility or under responsibility, however, there's a very, very often repeated principle. But what it actually means that law is putting some rather minimal requirement, but the expectation is that the forest sector and owners and industries, they will behave well, going above the law on voluntary basis. And actually, forest certification plays quite a big role in implementing this in practice. And I said, forest management plan is quite a simple technical thing, yes, more or less similar if you look at it. But quite interesting differences here, just inside same country, same region, but differences due to planners working at different organizations. Surprise, surprise, Swedish Forest Agency, they mentioned this tool for the owner and so on, but very importantly, it's an important instrument to reach forest policy goals, explicitly stating that. None of the Södra planners mention that. They don't think in those terms. So of course we do a plan for the owner, but actually very, very importantly, we do a plan for the Södra too. Because Södra can get information about what timber is standing out there in members' forests and see, okay, maybe it's time to encourage the owner to harvest. So supplying timber to Södra is a very important part of the purpose why we do planning. And why we encouraging planners to, the owners, members of Södra to make plans. Lithuania, quite different picture. So you see owner on average 3 hectares, voila, very close to France. Do you know how much is France? From statistic, what I saw is 4 hectares. 10 times less than in Sweden, but very close to Lithuania. And normally the planners, they are freelancers, so they're not affiliated to some organization. They just work on an individual basis as an individual company and then make contract to owner and do a plan. An enormous difference in the environment. to compare to Sweden, much more regulated. In this certain site conditions, you should do this or that species to thin or not thin that intensity, or there are maybe some restrictions due to land zoning or whatever. Very many things. We once counted 6,000 pages of different sorts of regulations, legal acts. So this is not that like maybe officially repeated on the agenda, but I would summarize like plan and control. That is guiding principle. And of course, Lithuania absolutely not unique. There are many countries like that in Europe. So now a question to you again. Should forest management plan be mandatory, in your opinion? So two extremes, never. Another extreme, but yes, for all forest estates. What do you think? I'm not asking now what is, but what do you think should be? So how many vote for no, never? Jens, who is from Denmark, Nordic spirit, I'm so happy. Okay, maybe 2, 3. How many think that yes for all states? Okay, so not too terribly many, but of course I was a bit extreme because I was asking about extremes. So those who answered, I guess you somewhere in the middle, right? Hopefully. Okay, what's the reality in France? How it is in France?
20 hectares.
Exactly. Back in time it was 25, and there are different stipulations.
Now with the mic. It used to be 25 hectares minimum. I mean, minimum. Above 25 hectares, you have to provide a forest management plan. Now it's 20 hectares with some, on the same, whatever, like some details, but it decreased to 20 hectares to kind of force, to increase this number you were showing that the forests in France are not heavily managed, that some of forests are not managed because the ownership is too small. So it reduced.
Totally correct. And there are, I think, very interesting stories behind to see what is happening and why, for example, it was decreased from 25 to 20. But that's, of course, one of the purpose to activate owners in France. So, yes.
But I have a question. So what's the threshold value in other countries? It's in France 20, but in...
Yeah, so every country is a different story. And I'm just coming to this point for these 2 case countries here. In Sweden, there is no such requirements. If you are certified, then yes, you have. Around similar, I think it was 25 or 20 hectares. In Lithuania, it is, as long as you want to carry out final felling, you have to have a plan. Which is, in my mind, a little bit crazy, because besides the plan, you also need to get cutting permit. So everything will be rechecked again and again several times. But anyways, it doesn't matter. You can have 1 hectare. If you want to harvest forests, you have to have forest management plan. Is it good or bad? I leave for others to decide, but in my mind, it's maybe a bit exaggerated. Approved by authorities? Well, in Sweden, not at all. In Lithuania, absolutely. Well-stamped plans. Now it's a bit better. Back in that time when I was investigating, so you have to go twice at least to a certain particular authority in one part of the country to get the stamps put on the paper. Now it's digital, so some improvement. But anyways, definitely yes. Linked to certification, like interesting from this policy perspective. In Lithuania, no, because very few private estates would be ever certified, but it doesn't make much sense. You just get extra costs and basically no benefit. Very different case in Sweden, because the sector, I mentioned this freedom and the responsibility. It would be a long story to explain in details, but basically industries have created internally, not by final consumer, but internally, a demand for certified timber. So you get a price premium if you get certified. And in order to get certified, you have to have forest management plan. And that is very important motivation for many forest owners of a bit bigger size when you intend to harvest reasonable amounts of timber to order forest management plans. So it's very strong link. Inventory, of course, it's always done for plan. And already comes from earlier talks. In Sweden, there are some requirements, but very few. For example, cultural heritage. If you have some stone wall or something, you have to take care. But not much. It's mostly recommendations. And opposite in Lithuania, some recommendations, but mostly the stipulations. You have to do this or do not that something. Consultations to the owner, not so much in Lithuania because what you can consult. You have to follow the law. In Sweden, yes, but I put it in parentheses and you will see why. So from that sample of 12 interviewed planners, I divided them in advisory and not advisory. So two quotes from both come from Södra. Advisory planner states, it is possible to discuss really many things with the owner when one explains, when the owner understands. So this guy, he was using, I don't remember now the exact number, but somewhere between 1 and 2 hours on average to go through the plan and explain to the owners why you should do this or that and why it could be a good idea and so on, explain. And one quote from what I call non-advisory planner, he said he used to have also such talks, 1 hour, but they always faced pressures. You have to do more plans per year. Why you do so little? And they were sitting and thinking, where could I cut time, make it more efficient? And then they sit with the boss there in the local district and say, but talk to the owner. That's an easy way to reduce the time for planning. Good or bad? In my mind, maybe really bad, because if it's in Sweden that is a liberal country and that you're supposed to guide owner through advice and information, and you cut away this part. Sample is not very big, 12 people, but at least from that, it was quite interesting to me to plot this and make a small regression analysis. Correlation between planner's age and contact with owner. So what is your conclusion? Why can it be like that? The old guys like to talk a lot, right? No, I don't think so. That's at all a reason. That's because of this push to effectivize, and the young planners, they get into this culture and they get pushed even by the boss, do less. The old guys, they refuse. No, it's important, I think we have to explain to the owner, so they keep their way. But a bit unsettling correlation here. Lithuania also, I just put two quotes. One guy who I called Eilidis because he was really believing in better future for owners and everything, but very, very disappointed. And I think he stopped the planning soon after these interviews. Punishment, punishment, this is encoded in the law. As for incentives, there are none. So he's very, very depressed by this picture. A prolific planner, prolific, it's meaning that he was producing many plans, one of the most prolific in Lithuania when I looked up statistics. Very interesting conversation, by the way. What he was saying, you bring the project, they take and sign it, you leave money from time to time, or sometimes a small bottle. And you can bet it's not a mineral water, something stronger. All of these inspectors give my phone number to owners. And sometimes I leave some 100 euro or so for these inspectors. Time is money. So what is this? Maybe put it boldly, that's a corruption or bribe. Right, because this is, you give money under. I was quite astonished that he was saying this quite openly to this strange researcher from Sweden. But yeah, that's the reality. And that's the thing. If you have very strong regulation on anything, you create a rich substrate for corruption. Quite logical. And this is a nice summary of these findings. If you think at forest management plan as policy instrument, that was very, very difficult question to the planners. They were really struggling. What do you mean forest policy instrument and plan and so on? But after some explanations and talks, I was forcing them to distribute percentages between these three dimensions: regulatory, economic, informational. So it was a bit shaky, different answers from different planners, but I made averages. I was super happy. It corresponds to my picture very well. In Sweden, 60% more or less informational, 20% economic, 20% regulatory. That totally corresponds to my picture of things. In Lithuania, surprise, surprise, 80% regulatory and 10 left for other two each. So to make some sort of conclusion as staying home messages, what I wanted to say that forest management plan definitely is not only a planning tool, but also a very important policy instrument. And I know that is also the case in France for sure. And then it differs radically how you use a policy instrument. So I think these two countries showed a perfect example. And you may wonder, why did I present this 10 years older study here? Of course, partly because it fits the topic, but also partly because I think it would be extremely interesting to investigate it for France. If somebody would be interested, so I encourage get in touch and let's think. Of course, we're always busy and so on, but maybe we can do something about that. France is a very interesting country in many respects. And now we move to, oh, it's okay every time. Second big topic, forest advisory services in multiple contexts. And this is a project that, as I mentioned, just started this year. EU funded, a bit atypical project. It's not so-called research and innovation project, but more, we call it coordination and support action or something like that, because it has very strong practical inclinations. We have 32 partner organizations from 18 EU countries. Many of them are advisory organizations, like CMPF in France. It's made a representative from France, and actually leading one of the major work packages. But so it's a lot of this, how to create a network, but there are also some research packages like my own. I'm in work package 2, where we try to map and understand forest advisory systems in different countries and jurisdictions, and sometimes in the regional level. And what are the challenges relating to the call? So that capacity is a bit sometimes not so good to provide advice, in some cases at least. And of course, because it is EU, they want these two things. Some of you may have heard the word ACIS, or ACIS. That stands for Agricultural Knowledge and Innovation System. And that's quite a big thing in the EU. As you may know, a very substantial share of EU budget goes to agriculture, the Common Agricultural Policy cap. It used to be half of the EU budget, now it's less, but still a lot, 1/3 or more. And part of that is this ACIS system when you try to advise farmers on things. And then some people who are involved in that project too invented this other topic, I think quite nice, FOCUS. It's like ACIS, but for forest. So forest knowledge and innovation system. And the EU thinks, okay, if we should integrate FOCUS into ACIS, if we connect advisory service organizations in Europe, we are building bright future. Soon reaching nirvana, probably. But it's normal for EU calls, like this a little bit optimistic statements. And then what is FOCUS? If someone would be explained, so that is Anna Lawrence, a Scottish professor who is also in the same work package working, we work together a lot. They had this good paper to try and to define this forest knowledge and innovation system. They state that it's a purposeful assemblage of actors, organizations, and interactions intended to influence forest management behavior. And you analyze sort of as a system, because you have different sort of actors. So, of course, one important part, those who are providing advice. Then, of course, you have those who are recipients of advice. And there are some tools used to achieve those ends. And, of course, you have certain policy environment, including the regulatory framework. And that all boils down to some sort of objectives and outcomes of the system. So they made nice conceptual paper about that, with some practical examples back in 2020, but now we have excellent chance to really investigate it and see what it looks like in every EU member state. And without saying much about methods, but we have been interviewing people as well, deep interviews, very few, only 2 per country, because it's so many countries, so otherwise you will get drowned. But we have to really we made big effort to find knowledgeable experts who know the situation in the country pretty well. And long interviews, again, like 1.5 hours normally. that was done. Now we are compiling country descriptions and a so-called focus map. I will show some examples. And next step, we also do some small but still quantitative survey, going out to some maybe 15 people or so in each country and trying to quantify some of the qualitative findings. So for consistency, I will show examples from the countries that I presented already. Lithuania, my home country. You have forest belongs under the Ministry of Environment. And then you have these guys, Environmental Protection Department with all the regional units, 60 inspectors, and State Forest Service, 60 inspectors. Those look all sorts of things, like everything is compliant and for environmental requirements and so on. These guys mainly deal with forest management plans or cutting permits and so on. So we have these 250,000 owners, whereas 100 inspectors, more than 100 checking different things in the system. And then you have these green guys, not forcing something, but more voluntary basis. That looks, yeah, it's intentionally not very thick lines here because it's very little capacity. So we have Forest Owner Association, but only 1.5% of owners belong to the association, and they don't have any explicit advisory service. But there are some ad hoc people who sometimes idealistically, sometimes paid a little bit, but they give some advice here and there to an owner. But you cannot call it a systemic thing. And then we have this agricultural advisory service. That, of course, again, AKIS. They are pretty big organization for a small country, 400 staff. But almost all of them, naturally, they deal with agriculture, give advice on agriculture. So there are 4 people serving forest owners. Normally, it's farmers who have some forests on their estate. So it's quite interesting proportion, right? You can call, like, if you a bit strict, 4 people to give advice, 100-something people to control. Nice. To be an owner there can be a challenge. So what are issues? Of course, high number of owners, quite fragmented, similar situation to France, and quite clear distrust from authorities. Owners are bad guys. You better see that they don't misbehave, don't cut away their forest, whatever. So it's very clear imbalance between forest policy tools. So much regulation, like in that picture for plants, goes for everything. So much regulation. Okay, now there are some subsidies also from EU. So that's a good thing. But when it comes to this informational instrument, it's very, very weak, terribly weak. So I think there is a need for major rebalancing. So there is even not a single organization that would have forest advisory service as their main mission. I find it sad. So in that project, I think good chance we at least will show the problem. If we can deal with that problem, we will see. It's not so simple. Politics. Sweden, another country that you know about already. Very, very different picture. So we have about 300,000 of owners. And this is Ministry of Rural Affairs and Infrastructure in charge. And actually, there's not much steering, so there is deliberately not red color there. Some policy priorities and goes down to this body, Swedish Forest Agency. Quite resourceful. They are 700 people, but it was declining all the time, for many years. So now they do it more and more legal supervision, but also still some advice, but not so much. Before it was main body to go out in the woods and meet owner to give advice. Now not so much. Now it's mainly like information on websites, apps. We don't have resources for one-to-one communication. And they also deal with large forest owners, but that of course also supervised, but it's more like dialogue. But then you have very, very strong private sector. I already mentioned very well-developed industries. You have all these big multinationals, Stora Enso, SCA, and so on. And then you have also the forest owner associations, as I mentioned. They also run own industries. They provide a lot of advice. Can anyone guess what I mean by dual advice? Difficult question. But so one is like what we imagine easily. Give advice for the owner how he or she should manage forests in a good way, right? But something that you maybe can catch from this previous part on forest management plan. The underlying interest for them is to source timber. And of course, that affects what sort of advice is given. So very often they would still say plant spruce, 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 which maybe, if you have a bit different perspective, you can think about this is really good still to plant spruce. Situation like what you have in France, it will come to Sweden. It's coming already, very clearly. Lots of barbecue damage, for example. And if you try to summarize the needs, drastically reduce public advisor capacity, as I mentioned, and that leads to mismatch, because policy is saying very important production, but also the other values. 50-50, they say in the law. But if you let the liberal system, not much regulation, but advice is mainly with those who want to source timber, there is no balance in the system, right? So we have a lack of neutral advice options for the owners. A problem. And now I am walking on very thin ice, France. And maybe you will kill me after this, but or at least you can correct me. But actually, I was spending last week some days sitting and trying to understand the French system based on interviews, looking to ChatGPT and other sources. So this is the public part of the system. And basically, it looked in my mind, but please correct me if I am wrong, 3 ministries are quite important. First of all, we have this Ministry for Ecological Transition with fancy long name, but CNPF was transferred under it recently in the end of 24. And CNPF is very, very major body. It deals with all the forest owners in an interesting way because they give a lot of advice, but they also partly perform regulatory function, like approving forest management plans. So it goes hand in hand. Therefore, these arrows, they are very tied together. In Sweden, it's a totally different picture. In Sweden, if you are a forest advisor meeting over, crazy in my mind, but you cannot at the same time give advice and supervise. If you call for supervision, you are not allowed to say what is right. I think maybe could be. It's only the law. And then we have the Interior Ministry that itself maybe it's only important for firefighting, but then in each department, or whatever its exact pronunciation, we have these DDTs. DDT for me sounds something like not so good. Something anti-buck, and that was leading to big environmental problems back in 60s. DDT, you know, this. But okay, this is no, sorry. No, you see, I'm allergic to regulation. But no. But of course, it's good. We have separation of functions here. They conduct the legal oversight. And then we have Ministry of Agriculture and all these agricultural chambers. Very strong ACIS system, as probably most people in the EU know. In France, you have to watch out if you deal with farmers. There are 8,000 people totally in the chambers. And also we have actually some dealing with forest advice. So again, probably mostly serving the farmers who have some forest, but 100 people there. And from CNPF, they have totally 450 people, but according to our informants, about 200 that are actively working as advisors to owners. So that's the public part to the quite big number of private forest owners, 3.5 million. But then some more stuff comes. That's very interesting. Fransilva, Federation of Private Forest Owners. And I was so surprised. This is private owner organization. They have all these regional unions and departmental, interdepartmental syndicates, as they are called, that involve about 45,000 owners. They are voting members of the board for CNPF, for a public body. So it's a super strong alliance. All strategic decisions go hand in hand. So it's, I don't know how to call it, some sort of public-private partnership. And one of the interesting tools also that we, very interesting, I hope somebody is doing that research maybe already or will do, the so-called progress groups. by initiative from CNPF, they try, because one of the issues is how to activate owners. So they collect maybe some 10 and 20 people together in neighborhoods and try to encourage them to work together, to maybe they at the same time prepare plans for those owners and discuss things, and also promote some sort of peer-to-peer learning, but they learn from each other. So that's this, what it's indicating, learning on owner to owner, peer-to-peer. And plus, we have this other actors, private companies and independent experts. Very difficult to know. I hope to get it validated from our informants. From ChatGPT, I found this number, about 1,000 to 2,000 staff involved actively. And then we have 17 forest cooperatives, looked quite powerful, quite big number of owners part of it, and about 400 advisors. And then we have an environmental side. Not super strong, but still is there. And they have some people working as advisors for owners. So how to try to say what do you think, what could be the needs here or issues in this system? You mean it should get smaller or less complex? I don't know if complexity is a problem. It's also quite a big country. France is very, very interesting in that respect, but if you have other countries of the size in the European Union, like Germany, like Italy, they are federal states. And then each Bundesland or each county in Italy, whatever, they would have totally different forest policies. You have forest policy that is more or less same for the whole country. But probably it makes sense that to having like DDT at every department, because otherwise, like, no, it will be super centralized. But it's a pretty centralized country, obviously. So that is what informants they're stressing for us, these two people, two knowledgeable experts, that we have very fragmented ownership. It is 2.5 million owners managing 2.2 million hectares of forest. So a lot of people who have less than 1 hectare. It's not super easy to motivate them. So they're often not interested or passive, and so one of their policy goals how to deal with this very small scale owners. And if it's lacking management, quite often it depends on perspective. If you ask some from WWF, maybe they'll have different opinion. But most, at least forest experts, would say it's a problem, for example, in terms of fire risk. And then, actually, I think the French system was pretty impressive compared to many other countries. You have a system. But if you compare numbers, it's all the same all over Europe. Acres, it's so much stronger than focus. So here we have 8,000 advisors for 450,000 farmers. And some hundreds, okay, whatever exact number it is, of advisors for 3.5 million forest owners. So I understand when they complain that capacity is stretched, even though it is a system there. So probably there is a need for political recognition and stable funding for focus. And this is very rough, a bit ideological, biased, but some initial thoughts from what we see. So it will be fun to report back to you in some nice way that maybe they're not entirely realistic about their expectations, that you would integrate focus into ACES, put together with advisors from different countries, maybe exchange some ideas, do some training courses, and then we solve all the problems and reach nirvana. That's a little bit, let's call it optimistic. So what we rather should do, we have to, So it's again the same message from us from the first part. The context is so important to understand. What is really, who are the actors, what are the interests, what are your power? If you don't do that, your naive expectations are not worth so much. Because depending on what is out there, you need very different measures to meaningfully address these issues. and not just through some sort of uniformly integrating focus and takers all over Europe. It will not work. And there are many other things that we can take from that preliminary scoping interviews, but I think, very, very little time left for discussion. If some of you have time and want to discuss after 3 o'clock, for me, no problem. No more big obligations for today. Yes, so thank you and welcome to ask questions.
Thank you. So if any one of you have questions, please use and ask the microphone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was an amazing talk.
You.
The first part, so at one point you said something which kind of impressed me a lot, like while describing Sweden, you said you have the law, which is very low, and then everybody else is making some additional effort. That made me think that, like, the thing you were presenting, isn't it just another proxy of a political culture of a country? Like, this analysis is reflecting the things we could also deduce from different domains of public activities, political activities, isn't it?
Yes, to some extent it's correct. Because, for example, this freedom with responsibility terminology, was not invented in forestry. It is a general principle that was invented by politicians in Sweden back in whatever, I don't know, 70s or so. So they always regard this, that don't over-regulate, but rather try to walk more on voluntary basis. But of course, in forestry, you have extra complications because, as in any other country worldwide, I would say, it's very much contested field. It's so much interest coming, and now general population who wants to care for the environment and so on. So here you have really interesting case of course, it's raising environmental awareness of people and requirements and so on. But you at the same time have very, very strong forest industry sector and forest owner sector. So that's a very major clash of interest. But so far, the ruling political parties, they are still standing on that, okay, forest sector is a very important part of our economy, we have to defend it. So they don't radically. So now there is actually quite high opposition towards EU when it comes to forestry regulation, all the strategies coming. So they say we have to do, okay, we cannot go against EU, but just do it minimally. Now it's very clearly, there was recently made a big forest investigation this year, and it's a bit ridiculous. But from the government, when it was saying to investigate or what you should find out and or in a way, or what you should do, it was written clearly how to make as little change as possible for the Swedish economy, for example. So it's very powerful, that part of the game.
No, I was just thinking, because I'm not a political scientist neither, but there is this like a very interesting classification of different kinds of political cultures, like a civic culture, a subject culture, so there was some works, pretty known works, where we classify different countries in different bins. It would be maybe interesting to see if there are some matchings in between, like, for example, you know, like a civic culture would be a mix of all of these different ones. Participative would be a very liberal one.
Yeah,
where the society is very actively involved, and like the law is really just there for the very basis, like, and everybody else has like this very pronounced collective consciousness. So yeah, it's pretty deep. Yeah, it goes all the way to the heart of the society.
Yes,
yeah.
And of course that would be super interesting to make some sort of comparison like that, but also not very simple thing. But yeah, could be interesting to do. And there have been sociologists, for example, maybe some of you have heard Dutch sociologist Hofstede. He was measuring cultural dimensions between different nations. So how patriarchalic they are or not, and how it is based on individual values, individualism versus collectivism and so on. Very interesting. And of course, as you say, these general traits of the system of societal culture, they affect all the domains.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the talk. I have a comment about the French case. So
Great.
I have the third point. So no, in blue. So you said you have 1 to 3, I think. No. Yeah. Yeah, I think that in the third point you said that we have quite a lot advisory for farmers, and finally a few numbers of advisory for forestry. And in France, so being a forest owner is not a main job. And when we look at the statistics, we observe that among the private forest owners in France, approximately half of them said that their main job is a farmer. So I wonder if it is something particular to France, this connection finally between forestry and agriculture, and if it can explain why we have finally so few advisory in this domain, because I don't know, maybe they can give advice in the two domains finally, or something like that.
Yes, good points. So first of all, why it's all over the Europe, the agricultural advice so much stronger? There are several explanations probably, but one is that agriculture is a business. Normally, if you're doing agriculture, you not always, but quite often it's your full-time job, your occupation. And you would need lots of advice of all sorts, for example, on accounting, budgeting, and so on. Not only about how to grow this crop or that crop. So the market is very strong. If you take a forest, an owner that has 1 hectare of forest, very typical in France, yes, in very many cases, she or he doesn't care even at all. They maybe know where a forest grows, hopefully, but not always even that. So of course, that's part of the explanation. But maybe another part of the explanation still is that politically, forest has not much weight in the EU or in most member states. Look at the power that farmers have in France and the power that foresters and forest owners have in France. So, of course, there are many factors coming in, but this is also cannot be neglected. And I think better recognition politically of forest would not harm us and our colleagues.
It's actually related to the previous question. I was completely by chance. I was yesterday attending one meeting in Brussels, and there was this girl from the European, this kind of how they call it, like a union of forest owners, and then she was part of the panel where they discussed like things, and then she evoked CNPF, like a very rare example of a public body in a European country which really kind of which exercises this role. Mm-hmm. So even though there are maybe very few advisors, I guess it's also very good to have at least something, no, with respect to many other countries in Europe where you don't have it.
Exactly. Yeah. I even think it's actually quite, I don't know, of course, in every model or solution, there are also problems. But if you look at the large picture, probably it is a very good model that you have in France. Because you have state that wants and can even influence private owners through advice, and state, this was also very, very clear from interviews. Actually, people here who advise, quite often they would advise in different way than people here. People here mainly focus on profitable management. And of course, normally it's only the bigger forest owners who can afford, because normally they would need to pay for that advice. People here, they can talk about other values more. And as a public body, they can also talk to this owner who has only 1 hectare. So this is good, because in many other countries, like if you take Sweden and these more liberal countries, very often public bodies, they just withdraw. They don't do much advice anymore. They say, okay, we regulate, but then that's it. Leave it to the private sector. Or there are countries like in the Eastern Europe, like Lithuania, who we have very strong public bodies, but in their mind it's only this one, nothing else. So I think France is a very interesting case. Yeah, but I think we will show French case as an example for many other countries, because now we soon will have national workshops in each country, and we will show some examples, lessons. I think French case is interesting in a good way.
Thanks.
So when you compare the Swedish and the Lithuanian way of doing it, did you have some measure of how good have they been to actually achieve what the government's policy is on the ground? You know, where do you have more biodiversity? Is the country want to increase biodiversity in forest?
I think, for example, I made myself a study, actually quite soon, a year after from this management plan instrument from 2015, where I was looking at the legal requirements in Sweden and Lithuania and outcomes, what happens in practice, how forests are managed. So, of course, you can link that in Lithuania there is less intensive management, more diverse that for many reasons, partly the law. But in general, I think to measure this thing, how much advisory services have impact, it is extremely difficult because when forest management decisions, they are depending on so many factors. And advisory service is just part of a game. So there will be a lot of confounding in the sort of measurement. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm happy to see your interest. Sorry, but it's already past time.
So thank you very much, Vilis, for this
Thank you.
seminar.
Merci beaucoup.